So this will be part three of the series on how to be a better debater. Since everyone just loved the first two parts, I'll be going over like specific aspects of debating that I think people need to improve. And if you're a bad debater, then you might want to tap in. So this is for the moaners, the senjus, these are for the incompetent people, you know what I mean? Like, this is for the people who don't know what they're talking about most times. So, the first thing that we're going to go over for this video specifically is defense. Now, what I mean by defense, I covered it a little bit on how to make a good debater tier list. But again, what I mean by defense is the ability to actually be able to defend a point that you're able to make. So, usually, whenever you're like to work on your defense, first, the necessary condition is you have to be on the positive to actually work on your defense. Simply just saying, that, oh well, why, right? That isn't working on your defense, because everyone can say why. And again, you're obviously going to come into, like, you're going to get to a certain level where people are going to start asking you, okay, well, do you have an actual good basis for like the like how to explain this, like the extreme amounts of skepticism you put on a point? People are going to start asking you for a basis, then they're going to start questioning your basis. And people who don't have good defense, they're just not going to be able to actually, work on this. So the first thing you need to do, and this first part is going to be for like fiction. Actually, the main part is going to be for fiction. So the first thing you need to do to actually work on your defense, if you're debating something like inverse, you're debating something like crossverse, the like most important part is to actually know what you're talking about. So usually people are going to be able to defend their points better, even while on the positive, when they have a lot of knowledge about on the topic, right? So if you have a lot of knowledge on the topic, then usually even defeaters, even ones that you haven't usually heard before, usually they're going to pertain to a certain aspect of the topic that you probably know about. So again, being able to defend certain points very well is also like heavily influenced by your knowledge. Typically I see people losing debates because they are getting knowledge cliffed, and every single time they bring up a specific point, they don't know anything about it, right? Or single time they try and go on the offense and they try and asking, oh yeah, what's the basis for this, and the third, right? Immediately the other person knows and they have a scan that cites it almost verbatim. So yeah, one of the best ways to counter skepticism and also to counter just like weak forms of offense is through actually reading the series. Now, the second part that you want to do is being able to defend against equal interpretations. Now, equal interpretations, obviously, it's like a skeptic's way out. So what it does is it makes them, look at least a little bit better optically, because they don't have to continuously keep asking why. Instead, they can also just give their own interpretation of events, no matter how absurd they may seem. And if you explain to them, oh yeah, no, that's absurd. So for example, somebody says, oh, you shot him in the leg. And then person one chooses to interpret it as somebody got shot in the leg. Person two, seems to interpret it as, oh yeah, by shot, what they mean there is actually insulted. So you insulted him in the leg or something like that. Now, typically, whenever you're going against people who you like spamming equal interpretations, what you want to do is do some form of like semantic analysis on like the terms that are being used. So for example, if you're debating fiction and it's a specific scan that you're using, right? Typically what you're going to want to do is actually just like understand the words that are being used. Try and focus in on specific words that seem to align more with your interpretation rather than the other person's. Explain to them how the denotation of the word seems to support your point rather than theirs, and also how people colloquially use it. Now, equal interpretations, really, it isn't just a matter of who can send more scans to actually provide more evidence for their like interpretation, because obviously whenever two people like interpret a certain sentence, right, the interpretation that's going to be more likely is the one that actually aligns with most people's usages of the word, right? That's the one that's going to be more likely. So it doesn't always have to be a scan thing. You shouldn't be afraid if you want to defend your point very well. You shouldn't be afraid to appeal to other people in the call, appeal to how people colloquially use this term, right? And explain to people, try and catch them in a reductio. So for example, you could give an example A, so it's like, oh well, you're trying to interpret short as insult here, right? And then you give them other examples of short being used in the real world and explain to them how people typically don't mean this, so clearly your interpretation has to be flawed. And additionally, you can also just appeal to other people in the call. So again, whenever people listen, like see the scan and like read it upon like face value, they're going to have certain interpretations of the scan, right? And given the same sort of context that you have, if you just explain to them, or you show them even the panel before and the panel after the statement, right? People are immediately going to be able to build their own interpretations. And now you could also just explain to them, or you could just appeal to them as some form of probability raiser to say that your interpretation would be, at least in context to the debate, would be more probable, seeing as like given the sample size of people you have, they all seem to support your own point. So again, you shouldn't be afraid to like appeal to other people. It shouldn't count as outside helps, especially whenever you're going into equal interpretation battles. Basically, what you're doing is just like, typically if you want to do like test which interpretation is more probable, that's like an empirical claim, right? So you'd also have to test, oh yeah, how do people use the language? Do people use the language in this way or the other way, right? And obviously it's quite literally impossible for people to like actually make or get a huge sample size of how people interpret a specific scan. So what you want to do is just appeal to the information available and say that within context of the debate, you're rationally justified in believing this. So it'd be as in, like, for example, people back then, they were rationally justified, at least in context to the information that they had, right, to believe that the earth was flat, for example, because they could observe the flat plane, they could observe all of these things, they could observe just the earth being flat generally, right, or at least seeming to be flat. However, if given more information which seems to go against these sort of like justifications that they initially had, then they would no longer be justified in believing the earth is flat. It's in the same type of way, right? But yeah, you should just be able to appeal to other people in the call for that type of thing. The other thing you want to do, and it's like very, very simple. I'm pretty sure Auden and them boys called it unification, but it's literally just giving a more parsimonious argument, right? So, for example, if like what you want to do is give a preponderance of evidence for a specific interpretation that you have. Now, people can say, oh, well, what if I give a different interpretation for each and every single panel here? Well, obviously you can do that. However, because of the fact that your interpretation seems to like try to force a disconnect between all of these different scans, whereas again another interpretation, another hypothesis could just account for it using that and that alone, right? It seems as if that one would be more probable. So I don't know if I explained it well in that instance, but the perfect example would be something like if there's different pieces of evidence for a murder, you have DNA evidence, you have a picture of them doing it, or a picture of them with a bloody shirt, you have a picture of them running away from the scene of the crime, like you have all of these different pieces of evidence. They all seem to be pointing in one direction, right? And they seem to point towards that person X committed a murder. However, of course, you could say that, oh yeah, well, this picture of them running away from the scene of the murder, they could just have been jogging by when the murder happened. And this other picture of them with blood on their shirt, they could just have been gone to the butcher's that day, right? However, immediately you can tell that, yes, one of these interpretations is way more probable than the other one, right? One of these interpretations doesn't require all of these other additional assumptions and all of these additional circumstances to have to maybe even occur for the interpretation to work. Whereas the other one, if you go assumption for assumption for all of these variety of interpretations to work, you have to assume and appeal to multiple different possibilities, right? And all of these possibilities need to have occurred or need to have a good likelihood of occurring for the interpretation to work, or even equal likelihood to your own for the interpretation to work, right? Whereas your own interpretation, it doesn't need any other external possibilities to occur for your interpretation to be probable, right? Or your interpretation to work. Your interpretation works just by accounting for all of the evidence given in one unified hypothesis. So again, those type of things, you could just say after accounting for all of the evidence, your interpretation accounts for all of them, whereas their interpretation they doesn't account for all of them, and they have to make a completely new interpretation for theirs to actually work. But yeah, I've seen don't know whether or not I personally agree with this, but I've seen people argue something like this before as well. So it's like if you have a preponderance of evidence for a certain case you have, and you only need one of those pieces of evidence for your claim to actually go through, whereas for the opponents to actually for their claim to go through, or for them to actually defeat your point, they have to defeat all of those pieces of evidence. So whereas you only need one to go through, whereas they need all of those things to fail, right? It'd be more likely that your interpretation is more probable, right? So it'd be akin as what's it called? It'd be something like this. So it'd be like, if you're doing Russian roulette, for example, where you have a bullet in a chamber and you spin it, you only need one of those like casings for them to be filled with like a bullet, right? For you to actually die. Whereas what's it called? For you to not die, you need all of them to not be filled with a bullet. That's why most people say that the better bet or the safer bet in this context, or the more likely or the better thing you should do in this context is accept the one where it has a way lower standard of evidence for your thing to be proven rather than this one. So it's like extraordinary claims require extraordinary evidence, right? Whereas in this context, right, not only is the claim like you can say that the standard of evidence for the claim is just really low, so you should be more rationally inclined to accept the claim rather than the other one where it needs all of these pieces of evidence to not work at all and not lend any credence to your point, or well, not lend any credence, but all of them need to stop, right, for what's it called, for their interpretation to work. I'll give a final analogy towards something like this, so like maybe I can understand it better and also you guys. So it'd be something like if I'm trying to invade a castle and I need to only break down one of the entrances for me to invade and win, right? Whereas they need to defend 5 of the entrances to actually survive. You'd say that it's more probable for me to actually win, right? Seeing as I only need to win one objective, whereas it's less probable for them to win because they need to defend and actually defeat 5 different objectives, if you get what I mean. So yeah, that's another sort of nifty argument you could use for probability. Is the sort of thing where if you apply it to your argumentation, apply these similar types of principles to your defense of your points, then you'll notice that people are way harder struck to actually be able to defeat these points, right? Using simple skepticism, right? These are some of the best sort of defeaters, at least to my knowledge, and this is what I've been told, right? To actually defeat certain points, certain sort of skeptic defeaters. So once you apply these sorts of principles to your argumentation, and it doesn't have to be word for word what I said, if you apply these certain sorts of principles to your argumentation, you notice, and especially argumentation when you're defending a point, you'll notice that in fact, right, in fact, your defense of points will get way better, right? And also you just notice that via being able to apply this and actually apply it properly, it makes you not only be able at absorbing arguments better, especially since this, I'm not sure half of the things I said most people actually know about. So if you're able to actually simulate these sorts of values and these sorts of arguments into your day-to-day defense of your points, right, then you could also say something or you could also just say that, okay, well, GG, my defense has gotten way better. In a philosophical example, it'd be something if, and this is the final thing I'm going to talk about, the last point of defense that I spoke about before. It'd be if X is true, then I could be committing a grievous or an offense that's very, very, very wrong, right? And you only need one piece of evidence to actually prove that X is true, whereas you need 5 pieces of evidence to prove that X is false, or you need to defeat 5 pieces of evidence to prove that X is false. So you're more likely to accept the one which needs only 1 piece of evidence to go through to prove that you're doing something to prove something that you're doing something extremely wrong, right? Whereas the other person needs to defeat 5. I don't know if that made sense. Maybe it did, maybe it doesn't. But that's all I'm going to speak about that last part. But yeah, your knowledge actually your knowledge plays a huge factor into it. Then the other thing is you also need to be able to, do self-critiques, right? So, for example, if you have an argument that you have and you're creating an argument, you need to actually be able to critique the argument on your own. So you need to be able to sit down and question, oh, well, does this argument follow? Well, does it follow? If it doesn't follow, then, you need to be able to get the chinks in your argument. You need to be able to fix them, whether it be through oh yeah, if somebody brings up this flaw in my argument, I'll respond this. So you need to pre-prep defeaters for certain arguments if you feel as if, oh yeah, this is an obvious flaw in there, right? Because if you notice the flaw and let's say you aren't good, right, probably that the other person is also going to notice this flaw as well, unless they're massively worse than you. And now, even though I'm a big downplayer, quote unquote, of rhetoric, right, your rhetoric also plays a huge huge part in your defense, because your ability to control the conversation, right, makes it so that you're able to drag the conversation in a certain sort of like area in which, yeah, even if you don't have a good defense for this specific point, right, you can drag the conversation onto another point where you have way better defense on there, right? And like, let's say the defense is in the form of knowledge, you can drag the point to something that you have like way more knowledge on, and that would be the way you actually defend the point. So your rhetoric actually plays a good part in your defense, but what you don't want to do is actually let your argumentation lag behind, because then if your argumentation lags behind, you run into the same sort of problem that I noted on in my video on how to make pro a better debater tier list. But yeah, that's it for this video. If you like the video, please remember to like and subscribe, something like that. Arianis sucks. He lost to T-Jump. I mean, I'm not even gonna say he lost. Alright, he did really poorly, and he was losing on meta ethics to T-Jump in that recording. But yeah, that's it for me. This has been Shinra, and I'm out.